get right into it. My name is Cory Kozmik. I'm the Environmental Management Biologist at Magnetawan First Nation. As David mentioned, I've been here for 5 years, kind of feels like going on 6 now. And I've been involved in a multitude of research projects and initiatives since I started here. And previous to here, I did work at the Toronto Zoo for 2 seasons, and I'm a graduate of Trent University and currently working on completing my master's in the Boreal Ecology program at Laurentian University in the Lipskis lab. And how I'm kind of frame this presentation is it's really important to speak to all the baseline research and monitoring that we've done with the community and how that allows us to generate future types of research and adaptation planning and especially monitoring programs. So I'm going to kind of give you a nice broad approach as to everything that we do, but also how it pertains to climate change and adaptation planning and traditional ecological knowledge. So a little bit about myself. I kind of just went over this. I'm a Trent grad. I'm now working on my master's at Laurentian University, worked at the zoo, and part of my job here is less so in the field these days. I'm more of a desk biologist now, but I work on project development, site assessments, partnership development, research design, and project management. And I'm very lucky because now I have 2 more full-time biologists that work for my programs alongside a technishon. This will be her 4th year here, and she's a community member at MAG, and she's going into her 2nd semester at Nipissing University in biology because she's been working with us for so long, and now she wants to be a biologist and also likely pursue graduate studies in the field. So I'm very proud of her, and I'm very proud of our team. But we also have some monitors in the community, and I'll kind of get to that as well. So to touch on some of the projects that we have done or are still doing, we've completed a traditional land use and mapping study, a capital plan, a land use plan, an environmental management plan, fishery and fish and rivers monitoring. Of course, all of our original research kind of started because of the MTO Highway 69 expansion. As if you've ever driven up 69 between Parry Sound and Sudbury, you'll notice that it goes from 4 lanes to 2 lanes, back to 4 lanes. And right now they're attempting to kind of streamline that 4-lane process all the way north to the south to improve just movements and mitigations for that highway. And because it goes through Magnetawan First Nation, and we have a large magnitude of animals and species at risk and road mortality, that's kind of what started our programs. And we were part of the Henvian Wind Farm and transmission line development over the last few years. And we have been funded 7 and now 8 years. I just found out that we were approved for another 3 years, funded under AFSAR, which is the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. We found that out just recently. We're also part of the Indigenous Guardians Network in Canada, and of course, part of the community-based climate change monitoring program funded by Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada. So just to speak to some, we have a lot of partners, but some of our main academic and funding partners are Environment and Climate Change Canada, Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, McMaster University, Boreal Water Futures Program, Laurentian University, and Mount Allison University. And the title of our project is Integrating Traditional Knowledge and Western Science to Monitor the Impacts of Climate Change on Culturally Significant and At-Risk Ecology of Indigenous Lands. A mouthful, I know, but it's absolutely worth it. So to speak to a little bit of our team, past and present, can you guys see my mouse moving around?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So this is our previous lands manager, Anthony LaForge, and he was an incredible mentor and leader. And we were very grateful to have him and the support that he gave us during the time that he was here. He recently just left us to join Magnetawan First Nation and start a new adventure and help them build a remarkable lands department that we have here. And we're going to miss him, but we still work closely with him as project partners. Our new lands manager is Samantha Naganosh. That's this lovely lady right here. She's also the deputy chief in this community, and she's been working under Anthony's mentorship and guidance for the entire time almost that I've been here. So we're very grateful and excited to have her, and she's already filling her role amazingly, and we're just extremely excited about it. And these are my biologists, past staff. This is the one who's going back to Nipissing this year. This is actually an individual member of our community who was a monitor last year, but now works for the Indigenous construction organization that's owned in partnership with this community. And he's their go-to species at risk environmental person. So basically he got all the training he needed here working with us, and now he's applying those skills in the field when it comes to development. And we're really happy about that, and so are they. And this lady right here is my field biologist, Nadine. She's also a wildlife rehabber, so she fits in perfectly with everything that we do here. So when we're talking about climate change and global warming, what is it? What is the difference? Why is it important? Let's talk about that. So when we're talking about global warming, it's important to understand that since the early 20th century, the Earth's surface has been steadily increasing in temperature. And I know it doesn't seem like much, but since 1880, the surface has increased by at least 2 degrees, and that's a lot bigger than it seems. And this includes things like the land, the ocean, and the atmosphere warming. And our climate is accumulating 4 atomic Hiroshima bombs worth of heat every single second. So for some more perspective, once again, 4 Hiroshima atomic bombs worth of heat every single second. That means that's over 2.8 billion atomic bombs worth of heat since 1998. Kind of mind-blowing, I know. So when we're talking about climate change, it's kind of a response to all this warming that we've been seeing. So the heat from the fossil fuels emissions that we're experiencing, they are trapped within the Earth's atmosphere, and these gases are creating that greenhouse effect. So the response that we're seeing are things like extreme weather events, forest fires, hurricanes, our sea levels are rising and they're warming, our seasonal timing are changing, and it's very hard to keep up with, especially if you're an animal that's not really good at adapting to rapid change. And we're losing large glacial land masses. We're losing our permafrost. We're having very out of control wildfires. Our coral reefs are being damaged. The marine life is being damaged, and our storms are becoming angrier and angrier every single year. So with that said, it's important that we think globally, but we're acting locally. So what can we be doing up front right now to help with the bigger picture? So to talk a little bit about Magnetawan First Nation, we're actually sitting within the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve, which is a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve. And you can see our little dot right in here, that's us. And for a little bit more of a close-up, this is also us. And we are 4,700 hectares of land, and it's basically consistent of pristine and contiguous wetlands and rocks and forested areas. We have marsh, swamp, fens, bogs, and peatlands. And we have a remarkable biodiversity hotspot for species at risk reptiles. And also it's an important travel route for ungulates such as deer and moose, and important habitat for our fur bearer species like mammals, and also birds and insects and amphibians and more. We have a wide range of animals that live here. So when it comes to climate change, what are we concerned about? So firstly, impacts to the resources. This is our Mag River here. It's a beautiful system that outflows into Georgian Bay. So we're thinking climate change, we think what goes up must come down. So when it comes to industrial things, contaminants and pollutants and pollution of the river. When we're talking about food sources, traditional fish stocks have been declining, and the number and health of moose populations have also been changing in a way that our communities are noticing it and also feeling the impacts. And when it comes to traditional medicines, the health and stability of those systems are also changing. So when it comes to the environment, we need to be considering things like how weather and invasive species are impacting the greater health of the system. So we're seeing a lot of changes in the seasonal timelines of animals and migratory timelines and patterns, and also growth rates of vegetation. We're having longer summers, shorter winters, and vice versa. Excuse me. And we're having more extreme weather events and flooding and wildfires. I don't know if you guys know about this, probably do, but in 2018, we had the Parry Sound 33 wildfire, and that lasted for months and months, decimating thousands and thousands of acres of pristine habitat, and especially wetland systems that took thousands and thousands of years to develop over time. And it was a very significant impact to the overall system, and it's going to feel the weight of that for a very long time. And this is a picture of the smoke that you could see from one of our wetlands. It got very close to home. And so with that in mind, it forced us to really think about how things are changing in such a volatile way every season, and what adaptation might look like, and you know, how can we kind of get ahead of this. And when it comes to invasive species, because the northern range limits of a lot of species is increasing because things are warming up, it's making room for a lot of new invasive species. So if you look up here in this image, this is called Phragmites australis. It's a highly invasive reed species that sits in dense monoculture patches and essentially swallows up all the space for all of the native wildlife and vegetation to live. It's highly invasive and highly destructive to systems, especially water systems. So when it comes to impacts to wildlife, we're talking about this invasive species. So even when it comes to river, we're looking at sea lamprey, carp. They destroy habitat and they're out competing our native species. When it comes to parasites, when I spoke to the northern limits of ranges changing, these guys are coming up higher and higher, but also their seasons are becoming larger, which gives them more turnover time for their life cycles. And if you look in this picture here, these are called winter ticks. These are something that occurs while naturally occurring in our moose and deer populations. They're completely prolific now and out of control, and it's very difficult for these animals to manage. And it's actually causing a large scale mortality in things like moose. So that's which is a wildly traditional resource. So it's very important to understand how the large picture of the system is impacting these resources. And when we're talking about habitats, the quality and quantity of habitats are changing, especially when it comes to wetlands. So why are wetlands important? Well, for one, when it comes to resources and traditional resources, these sustain things like hunting, trapping, food, and medicines. These are some medicines that occur in wetlands, such as cranberries, wike, which is called sweet flag, yellow water lilies, pitcher plants, which is actually a carnivorous plant and actually can swallow salamanders. Very interesting and dark, but here you are, it's biologist thing. And white water lilies. And these guys all grow in wetlands, so they depend on the stability of the system to survive and persist. So when it comes to the environment, wetlands sequester and hold such a large percentage of Earth's carbon, and they also act as water filtration systems and floodplains, and they filter all the water that returns back out into our systems. So wetlands play a very crucial role in maintaining the health of our systems, but they're also very vulnerable to things like climate change. And when it comes to wildlife, they're a home for many species, including aquatic species. It's foraging habitat, and also facilitates critical life stages and nesting habitat. So when it comes to some traditional resources, such as moose, beaver, goose, and muskrat, these animals use wetlands for things like food and foraging, travel, thermal regulation, bathing, predator avoidance, and nesting. But our specialty is reptiles. And we've had some intensive reptile research programs happening here for almost eight years now. And these are the guys that we focus to look at, that we have been looking at the most up until now. And while we continue this intensive research initiative, we are stepping out and branching off into many new ones as well. So the purpose of this program and the purpose of this work is to foster the collaborations between Indigenous and academic communities. When it comes to traditional knowledge, something I like to tell my Western scientific friends that learned everything through a very Eurocentric lens of academics. Basically, in the last few minutes of time, scientists have learned to, they've learned to quantify, measure, characterize, and label things that have been known and understood and practiced for thousands of years by the Indigenous communities of this earth. And so it's a very, very important method of knowledge that needs to be applied in equal applications when it comes to research, planning, and adaptation. So the work that we do weaves that traditional knowledge into our planning, research, and management strategies. And within this, it allows us to build a capacity, and it also allows us to identify risks to Indigenous communities, the lands, and the resources that are vulnerable to climate change, and facilitate that adaptation planning. Because we need to understand how things are happening from the big picture and appreciate the interconnectedness of it all to really understand how we can approach and direct those types of research initiatives by stepping back for a second and opening another eye to a different way of seeing and understanding things, and actually learn how well that the two ways of knowing really complement one another. I can't tell you how many times coming in here as a Western scientist, my mind has been actually blown with the way things have been described to me or taught to me, and how much that translates into things that I already know, but really continue to just round out that better understanding of how I understood that whole big picture. It's incredible. So we weave 3 different types of science into the work that we do, which means Indigenous science, Western science, and citizen science. So when it comes to Indigenous science, we are gathering centuries of land-based knowledge that reflect environmental change over time. And this helps us to understand the impacts to environmental and human communities in response to climate change. And we weave this knowledge into all aspects of our research, adaptation, and planning. When it comes to the traditional ecological knowledge side of things, this is a sacred knowledge and a sacred understanding of the world, so it must be treated and respected as such. So anybody who's involved in collecting this information or knowledge undergoes traditional ecological interview training for our technicians, our youth, and our community members who are involved. And this is to interview our knowledge holders using strict ethic guidelines. We speak to elders, hunters, youth, and land users. And we always make sure our youth monitors are involved in the process, because we want to make sure that we're always facilitating that intergenerational transfer of knowledge, because that's a large component in how that knowledge needs to be carried over across time. And within that, we're able to extrapolate information that we can use for future research directions at, of course, the allowance of the knowledge holders. And we can ask questions such as, what is your understanding and perspective of climate change? How does that impact traditional ways of life, both socially and culturally? What does that mean for the land, water, and wildlife, such as moose, resources, reptiles and amphibians, medicines, and fish? Last fall, we hosted our first large workshop called Connecting Guardians in a Changing World, and this connected our Guardians project and our community-based climate change monitoring project. It was a fantastic success, and it was really exciting to have people from all across the region gather and share all this information together. So we had elders, language speakers, youth, researchers, and conservation organizations here from across the region. The youth facilitated all the discussions on various topics about threats of climate change as they pertain to traditions, traditional ways of life, and how we consider species to be cultural keystone species. So not what you would consider to be, you know, how we contemporarily understand a keystone species, but in a traditional sense, what species are foundational for the function of a system, and what happens if that changes as a result of climate change. So it helped us to identify some new topics and species and direction. We had a hands-on meet and greet with some of our Ontario reptiles, which was really fun. I'll go back to here. This is Lennox, and him and his pals originally were like, ew, get that thing away from me. And then we explained it a little bit to them, how fun these snakes are, what they're all about. And by the end of this, the kids were fighting over who got to hold the biggest snake. So a lot of what we do focuses on building those relationships with nature and understanding that interconnectedness between us all. And it was really nice to watch that shift and how the kids and community received that relationship with the reptiles that were brought in. But most importantly, this gathering allowed us to foster new relationships and build a collective of individuals across this region that are focused on climate change and traditional ways of life and future adaptation strategies. So what we also do, can you see me moving this little thing around? We have teaching days with youth and elders and language speakers. We had a language speaker coming in all last summer to teach our team and community and whoever wanted to join about environmentally based language in Anishinaabe-Moan. We have still our community-based monitoring programs, and I'll get a little bit into that. And interview training, we created jobs, resume development, and we continuously engage our youth and build local capacity in our community. And we're always actively learning on the land and trying to promote that as best as we can. So some of the work that we've done with our communities is traditional resource mapping and monitoring, traditional species monitoring. We have BioBlitz surveys where we take out the kids and community on nature walks, medicine walks, and learn about traditional land uses. And we're also aiming to develop greener initiatives in the community, and sustainability. This image here is from when we opened up our pollinator gardens that were planted in partnership with the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve. And this is the berry picking day where our staff took all the youth out to our blueberry patches and discussed the importance of that as a medicine, but also the Massasauga rattlesnake that sits within them and its important application as protector of medicines and why they're significant and important parts of our ecosystem and not that scary, but still need to be respected. So our team is always learning on the land, either with professional individuals on our team or elders or other people that join us from other partnerships. This is a Blandings turtle that Emily caught and was processing. And this is our elder, Richard. He works very closely with our program, and he's always taking out our youth and our monitors out on the land to do various activities. And when you're out on the land with Richard, you're always learning things because he's like an encyclopedia, and it's awesome. So our community monitors are amazing, and they change a little bit each year. And we've had a lot of people come through and have the opportunity to learn and have the experience working with our team for a season or even several seasons. So these guys and girls, they monitor development activities across MFN. So all we ever want to do is make sure that our team is available to facilitate and monitor any type of land use or development that's happening, so we can always be working with the environment in mind. And within that, our teams are always developing new skills and research monitoring land use as they join our teams out in the field. They're out on their own monitoring species, traditional resources, and culturally significant areas with other elders and land users. They collect the data from our climate change equipment, which I'll also touch on. And they worked with our elder all last summer to start building our cultural environmental trail system. And as you can see here, it's a remarkable trail system. This is basically our entire community. So we have a lot of land, but our community is very condensed into one little area. So they built a beautiful large trail system to connect everybody to move around on foot. And we're going to be placing a lot of interpretive signage and areas that connect environment and culture and language into this system for the community to use every single day. And we had a community get together to name our trail, and it was named Magnetawan, which means place where spirits walk. And it's, of course, never a dull moment here to show you some of the species that we work with. Everybody gets a wide, diverse range of experience and species I get to work with here because it is such a magical place. So when it comes to Western science, we have a lot of really intense research initiatives and partnerships. And with regards to our climate change program, we have what's called an eddy covariance open path weather station, which is this guy right here. And it's about a 30-40 foot tower that sits out in an important wetland system way out in the bush. Boy, was it a treat to install, but it's there permanently now. And it collects continuous micrometeorological data, but also within that, our teams are constantly monitoring across MAG the seasonal timing of animals and their behavior, bioacoustics. So we are monitoring frog calls because what we learned from the community is that frogs are actually bioindicators for traditional land use. So when the spring peepers start calling in the spring, that indicates it's time that the fish are running, and that's when spearing season begins, which is another very important cultural timeline. But as the seasons shift, these timelines are kind of off. So by using this knowledge and applying our ability to monitor these systems, we have been installing different types of equipment to better understand those shifts and make sure the community is on top of it using the data that we have collected. We can complete emergence surveys for our reptiles because most of our reptiles overwinter in and around the wetland systems, and they emerge at different times each year depending on what the weather looks like. And because our weather shifts so much due to climate change, it's really important that we have a good understanding of how it's impacting these systems that these animals depend on so greatly, which means we are monitoring their critical habitat. And critical habitat basically means a part of an animal's habitat that you can't remove from them because it facilitates critical life stages or staging areas such as nesting and overwintering and things like that. And we're also looking at migratory movements and seasonal movements of aerial species such as birds, bats, insect migration, And we installed a telemetry tower on top of our building called a MODIS tower. And it basically sits up there and it can pick up any species that flies over top that has a transmitter on them. And with a partnership that we've made, which is called the CNPP, the Community Nominated Priority Places that we are a partner in, that collective has installed 7 or 8 across the whole coastline. So we can build a much bigger picture as to who's doing what, who's going where, and how we can plan future research. When it comes to our work with McMaster University, we are using both TEK and science to monitor those implications. And they're measuring indicator variables for the SARS species and the reptile habitat suitability. So this is another picture of what our tower looks like, and some winter monitoring. But what this looks like is measurements of water level, peat soil temperature, snow depth, seasonal plant development, ecosystem fluxes. And these are incredibly important to species, just to reptile overwintering, because when they rely on wetland species or wetlands to overwinter, they rely on that stability of the wetland to make sure that that's a successful overwintering. Because we have had large die-offs because of volatile falls and springs. So the more we can build a better picture of how that's changing over time and what ourselves and our community are seeing, we have a better idea of what the impacts look like on the species. So when it comes to climate change and land use, we're looking at things like road construction, as ecosystems can shift along a wetness gradient depending on how that water balance is affected. And we can be determining whether these systems are being pushed outside of their typical range of optimal performance by monitoring these systems for long term. So we want to understand if their behavior is changing. And when it comes to things like traditional resources, we have completed a moose traditional ecological study to identify changes in moose populations and behaviors, better understand the resource and habitat, how these changes have impacted traditional ways of life, how climate change has likely played a role in that. What does this mean for the future? How does your community be forced to adapt and change to this? We recently actually finished this report and reached out to the communities that were involved to present all the findings and discuss the next steps and objectives. And we're actually going to be starting a new moose monitoring project that actually looks at presence, occupancy, habitat, and numbers. So stay tuned for that one, because it's going to be really interesting. And these are some of the main reasons that we want to maintain these traditional species, because it's so important that the communities have this. And this is Dr. Jessie Pop. She is one of our project partners and a mentor of mine, and someone that we do a lot of our research with, including the moose monitoring and all of our traditional knowledge-based research. This is Erin Hayward. She actually teaches environmental Indigenous studies at Fleming College, and Jessie now has a lab in Guelph University, and she's actually here right now. Hi, Jessie. So, to continue on a little bit more of the Western science, this is a hobo logger up here. And this is a waterproof logger that we place into the same systems as our fish are running or our reptiles are in. So we have them in our wetlands and our river system. And our monitors go and collect that data, which basically Bluetooths it to the phone, and it gives us a spreadsheet of continuous temperature changes. So on top of that, below here, we have an SM4 song meter, which tells us when the frogs start to call, which species of frogs are calling, and even the frequencies of their calls. So we can start pairing all this data that was actually guided by traditional knowledge to understand these changes and kind of get ahead of them when it comes to things like adaptation and making sure the community can still fulfill those traditional practices. We're also getting into bats. This is our newest endeavor, and we're working with the Toronto Zoo and other organizations to generate a better understanding of what's happening with our bat populations, where they're located, how climate change impacts their migratory routes and just general behaviors. And yeah, so when we're talking about things like wetlands and the species that we're predominantly studying, especially in the context of climate change, Now that we know why wetlands are so important, it's important to know why turtles are so important for wetlands and those ecosystems. So our turtles actually maintain the health and function of our wetland systems, keeping the water clean and the system functioning well. They also manage the food webs within the wetland systems. They propagate seeds and fungus between forest areas and wetlands because they do make large movements across land. They're culturally significant, and they're just generally awesome species. And we all rely on these wetlands and plants and animals that inhabit them to keep our environment and society healthy. So when it comes to our turtles, these are one of our main study animals. And so we monitor their behavior in certain critical habitat areas, and we pair our behavioral data and ecological data with our climate data to observe relationships between things like spatial movements, emergence timelines, habitat changes, and just behavioral changes. And when we ask the community about turtles and climate change, we want to know what do these turtles mean to our communities, but how do these seasonal changes impact how they observe animal behaviors, and what do they think that means for the future? And Magnetawan First Nation was the first First Nation to have an incubation facility to this degree, I think, in all of Ontario. And it started by essentially collecting turtle nests in areas that were very vulnerable during construction and development, like the wind farm, in the highways and culvert replacements, etc. And it just kind of spiraled into a much larger project. So now we have permits to collect anywhere in the district where there are nests identified as vulnerable, and we bring them back to our facility and we incubate them, rear them, and hatch them out. And then we release them back to where they came from to make sure that they re-enter those populations, but as turtles. It's actually very hard for a turtle to actually make it to adulthood. Usually only 1% of a mother's life's work will make it to replace her to do the same. And so we want to make sure that these hatchlings can actually make it from an egg to a hatchling, which is very hard itself due to things like predation and just nest destruction. So last year, we hatched out a total of 762 turtles, almost 500 of which were on MAG, and around 268 were off MAG. We were in the Anishinaabe News during our release, and it was a fantastic day with our community and other partners, and we even had APS show up. We had the CP Rail Police show up. We had our partners from the wind farm show up, and we had our elders and our youth and our community members and team, and it was an exciting day to release these little guys back into the wild. And it's really important that we're able to show the youth in the community the full circle of the work that we do, from eggs back into nature, but also learning the significance, both culturally and environmentally, as to why we do what we do. Just to kind of show you a little bit more about what we do. This is one of the Massasaugas that we work with in our program. And this is us also releasing turtle hatchlings with more project partners, and a turtle that was released after it was injured, rehabilitated, and then placed back out into nature. Our program also is a first aid facility for injured turtles, so people can bring them to us as a first response station to kind of stabilize the turtles and get them to the nearest turtle hospital to be healed. When we're talking about snakes, it's always a touchy subject, trying to get people to build a relationship with snakes, but it's also important that we help them understand the significance, both culturally and ecologically, as a role that they play. So in Anishinaabe culture, they bring benefits to our ecosystems, humans, and they they're pest eaters. So they eat pests that carry disease or decimate crops. They're also known to control ticks, and also their venoms contribute to very important science. For example, copperhead venom contributes to breast cancer. They're very important members of our ecosystems, and they're also considered to be medicines. In their culture, they're healers, helpers, and protectors. They're a clan animal, and they're associated with women and water. They're protectors of medicines, as I mentioned with the Massasauga rattlesnake, and they're commonly represented on petroglyphs and petroforms. When it comes to things like gestation, it's really interesting to know that the Massasauga rattlesnake actually gives live birth. So it's really important that she finds a spot every summer or every other summer at this northern range to basically sit and bake her young. She needs something that is perfect for her thermoregulatory needs and habitats. Make sure she has the perfect location to sit all summer and gestate her young, and then they can be birthed and disperse about a week or so after the fact. What's really important is these surveys that we conduct allow us to better understand the changes of these gestation sites with regards to things like climate change. And that includes things like temperature, weather, and just habitat change, vegetation change. And we also have ample feedback from our community. They tell us whether they're seeing Massasaugas or not this year. This year, a lot of them have been coming to us and being like, where are all the Massasaugas? And we're like, well, we're trying to figure that one out. So it's either an off year or something else happening. But as we continue to collect all of this baseline data, it will allow us to generate a larger perspective as to what's happening across time. So when we're talking about the river systems, especially in the context of climate change, this is the Magnetawan River. And of course, it provides habitat and food for our aquatic species. The rivers carry nutrients. They are drinking waters for our community. They play their role in the water cycle, and they maintain the balance of these delicate ecosystems that terrestrial plant and animal communities also depend on. And of course, the traditional ways of life and resources sit within this river. And of course, water is simply just the lifeblood of our existence. We can't exist without water. And when we are using and applying our land-based knowledge that's held by our elders and our land users, we're able to identify locations of areas to monitor species, and they share information based on things like habitat, spawning grounds, areas that are threatened by river flux and climate change, historical areas of abundance, and also the behavior of both the river and the species in the river. So as part of our river monitoring, we're collecting that continuous temperature data, and we also work with other partners and research studies to build us a better picture of what's actually happening in our river. So this is part of our water quality and characterization study, and this is Richard, our elder, and he was our go-to guy with his main helper, Dixie, the dog, collecting water samples for a few seasons to basically collect them twice per month at 5 sites to provide details with respect to spatial and temporal changes in phosphorus concentrations. And we wanted to assess the level of total phosphorus in the system and into Georgian Bay as it's outflowing into Georgian Bay, and also identify the human sources of phosphorus by working with the other communities. So this is Mag right here, and this is Brit, the community that sits right across the river from us. So we worked with them and to better understand nutrient loading in the community. And the good news is the Mag River is behaving like a natural river with respect to phosphorus concentration. And while sources of pH or phosphorus were identified, they're difficult to measure because it is a high-flowing river, so the dilution rate was pretty high. Another monitoring project that we did with the Georgian Bay Stewardship Council are things like spawning assessments, nursery, rearing, and foraging habitat, water chemistry, velocity of water, level fluctuations, aerial photography, fish observations, egg deposition, and plankton sampling. They actually stitched together large aerial temporal images across time to show us kind of how our edge habitat was changing. And when it comes to fish river habitat assessments, they wanted to identify suitable monitoring or suitable spawning habitat for things like sturgeon, sucker species, and walleye. We want to know where sturgeon are spawning and if they're spawning up the river, because it's a species that occurs here, but we haven't seen it in a long time. So the recommendations we received were basically find the sturgeon, determine more about water fluctuations in regards to sturgeon reproduction, and of course spawning and egg laying. We work with the AOFRC on walleye monitoring, and they started in 2014, but then they started it up again last year, and they attached tags to a series of walleye species and of course showed us where they captured them all. And preliminary results show a positive increase in the population size, which is really good. But also, this is Mag right here, where our fish were tagged, and this is where one of our fish were caught. That is one heck of an adventure. So this is the kind of information that's really important to understand how our species are using the system and collaborating with other organizations to contribute data to build that overall picture. So when we're talking in the context of sturgeon, a traditional species, we want to determine the importance of the Mag River as a species spawning habitat for sturgeon. And we wanted to collect local and traditional knowledge of their use in the river, but especially where are they? Using community members and their knowledge, we were able to determine areas where they have previously been observed and even possibly caught. But basically, we still have no idea where the sturgeon are. So this is something that we're going to continue to investigate and collect data on, and hopefully generate a better idea of where the sturgeon are and how the system is impacting that presence and what climate change plays within that. Working with Shared Value Solutions, we actually did a floodplain mapping project because due to climate change, we're seeing some pretty remarkable changes in river levels and water levels each year. Last year, we had severe flooding everywhere. This year was okay. But because of those changes, we wanted to better understand which areas are the most vulnerable and how can we adapt to those ahead of time to accommodate those types of changes. And in the previous year, all of these rocks were underwater and the water was up to here, and it was starting to serve a pretty large risk to our community. And so the better we can understand how these changes are occurring and also what the topographic characteristics of a riverbed looks like, we can then predict where these flood zones could occur and therefore how to adapt to it. When we're talking about those invasive species, and especially how changes in river temperatures and just the characteristics of the river, likely due to climate change and other factors, are impacting the river, we work with DFO on sea lamprey. And just to kind of talk to you about sea lamprey for a minute, they're highly invasive. They have a series of teeth that they latch on to other fish with and basically suck the life out of them. One individual can destroy up to 18 kilograms of fish. And it significantly reduces native fish populations, and the fish are not very happy about it. And so we try our very best to monitor the rivers for them to make sure that they are not able to replicate and proliferate the way that they have in other rivers. So every few years, we work with the DFO to administer lampricide, and historically it was not well received, but after further community engagement and working together, they are now applying lampricide every 3 years to the Mag River. But they also bring a helicopter because they need to drop their base camp at the top of the river. But they also take out our community members and especially our elders and give them a chance to look at the rest of the land that they no longer have access to. And that's another way that we can develop a very important insight to the type of knowledge that they hold over the land and what changes that they have observed and how can that can be applied in the context of climate change. So when it comes to Asian carp, it's a huge threat to the system because they outcompete species for food and space, and they absolutely destroy and decimate habitat, and they could arguably be considered one of the greatest threats to the Great Lakes systems. And we have a monitoring program also with DFO that annually monitors the river for Asian carp and their habitat, and they use electrofishing boats and different methods of collection to inventory and monitor the biodiversity of the river, and also identify these species. But also they always bring out our staff for that duration of time to provide new learning experience in the field of aquatic research and allow us to build our capacity within. When we're talking about those invasive species again, I mentioned it earlier, this is Phragmites, but how we managed it together is we got these things called raspberry cane cutters. It looks exactly what it is. This is a very sharp hook at the end. And we threw on our wetsuits and we hopped into the river, and this now looks like this. And hopefully we're continuing to monitor it over time, and this is what we pulled out of it in hopes that it will substantially reduce that population and prevent it from proliferating continually throughout that system. So when we talk about the next steps of our program, this was just kind of a summary of everything that we do. Otherwise, I'd have you guys here all day. So the next step of this research is we're going to be using this data and knowledge that's collected over and across our various programs to continue to build the capacity that we have, to continue developing new relationships and partnerships with other organizations, and assist other communities with that type of capacity building and research, stewardship, and conservation, getting other First Nations in the same kind of work that we do, providing them with frameworks and templates to develop community-based type monitoring and how they can apply community knowledge and some basic monitoring techniques to start building a baseline of knowledge and data, and using that to inform decision-making and any type of land use planning into the future. And we are now going to be focused more on research and monitoring, using the knowledge that we have collected with new research endeavors that traditional knowledge has guided. And of course, working with organizations and our communities for adaptation research and planning. So we do have small research, we do adapt along the way, but we are on course for building a large scale adaptation plan for things like climate change and resources and the environment. And the significance of the work that we do here is it's allowing us to redefine how we view that contemporary scientific methodology, and it's allowing us to elaborate on our existing programs and techniques that allow us to measure the impacts of climate change that are integral to strengthening the future management practice and adaptation strategies that our communities have here in response to things like climate change. So why do we do what we do? We want to make sure that we're continuously connecting back with the land and understanding how it's changing, and therefore moving forward together and protecting it and adapting to that change as best as possible. We want the resources and those traditional practices here for the youth tons of generations away from now. And it starts here. And it starts with using more than one type of knowledge to understand what's happening in the system so we can therefore protect it and move forward together. And we want to show the kids the connectedness they have with nature. And we want to raise a bunch of stewards of the land and continue this wonderful work that we do into the future for as long as possible. Because we all live on Turtle Island here. And she's given us all the life we could ask for. So it's now our responsibility to support her and protect her so she can continue to do exactly that for generations and generations to come.